Sorry about that.
Okay, are we good to all right, then we'll get us started. Okay, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tammy K. Smith. I am the director at Spring Hill Historic Home over on Wales Road. This is the first of our annual fall speaker series. So this year we are focusing purely on World War I for the centennial. We are also doing this as part of a World War I. It's going to be exciting. Ignore the vacuum. And they're getting water in at the ramp. This is part of our World War I exhibit that is opening on September 9th at Spring Hill. This is the centennial of Horatio Wales, going abroad and fighting in France, and his family's being involved in various aspects with World War I. So that is why we are celebrating kind of a year late. Everybody else started their celebration last year. We're starting when he actually got shipped over to France. So if you're interested, I do have more information about all of the events and things that are happening with our exhibit on the back table, along with all sorts of other exciting things that are happening at Spring Hill with this exhibit and without this exhibit. To kick things off, though, we have brought in Susan Talbot-Stanaway. Am I saying that right? I should have checked that before. Susan is the retired director of the Zanesville Museum of Art, formerly the director of the Muskingum Museum of Art and the Quilt Museum of Packet, Kentucky, and the Sioux City Art Center. She is an art historian with a concentration on American art and has curated over 500 exhibits. Recently, her research and curatorial efforts have focused on World War I, posters, and Ohio 20th century history. She has recently completed cataloging the World War I posters at the Ohio State Archives and the Ohio History Center in Columbus. So she has come from a bit of a drive and will be speaking with us today. So please welcome Susan Talbot-Stanaway.
Good evening. You know, I have worked at 3 different art museums that had World War I and World War II posters in their collection. And this is the 3rd group. At Ohio History State Archives, they had 3,000 that had never been cataloged. And of course, this was 100 years ago. And so I worked with a person there to catalog them. And one of the things I found really interesting is that we see famous posters. We'll be looking at a few of those. But also I found lots of posters that were local to particular cities, to particular events and things that happened, particularly on the home front. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the posters and the things that you see in the posters. The United States was only at war during World War I for a year and a half. But the United States produced more posters than any other country. And there were more changes to the nation and the people and technology than ever before. And so we'll look at the posters to see what things we can find out about the United States and the war and the home front from the posters. So, the one on the right, the James Montgomery flag, I think is famous to most people. There were more than 3 million printed for World War I, and I'll show you some of the history of that when we get a little farther, but then there were 5 million printed for World War II. So it was used again. The other one is by the same artist, James Montgomery Flagg, who came from New York State, who started as an illustrator when he was 14 and became a full-time professional illustrator for a newspaper by the time he was 18. Okay, what it shows is the poster was printed only 5 days after war was declared, and it was printed in the city of New York along with a special event, Wake Up America, that was held in New York. And it shows Columbia, who was the symbol for our nation. We'll see more color in a minute. And she's sleeping. She's sleeping in a very classical kind of setting. She has the Liberty Cap, which dates back to Roman times. It was given to slaves that were free. She recognize the one on the left? It was how the Declaration of Independence was publicized or given to the nation. It was printed up in simple multiples like that and distributed around the colonies that were in rebellion. It had been in existence since the 1600s when the printing press was developed. One on the other side is wanted poster, and those were among the most famous of posters designed to let people know that there were criminals that were around and showing their pictures and things. Okay, this is the first use of a poster for propaganda in the United States. Does anyone know who made this one? Does it sound familiar? Look familiar at all? Paul Revere, who rode his horse to warn everyone, was a silversmith. And he printed this print. And what he did, as a silversmith, he had learned how to engrave and etch on metal, silver. And so this is an engraving. He started out with a metal plate, and he drew the picture, and then he hand-colored it. Well, it's propaganda because, although it's an actual event, he has recolored it and revised the situation to make a different story than what actually happened. And it was intended, no, I'm going to leave him on there. It was intended to convince people that the British were evil and wanted to control the United States, and that the Americans were put upon or were not served properly by the British government. So instead of putting the scene in, it actually happened on March 5th. It was a snowy day in Boston at that time. Here we are in front of City Hall, and it looks like summer. It also looks, the men on the left are the colonists, the colonials, and they are dressed in upper middle class or middle class clothing. Well, actually, the people that caused the problem were sailors, ne'er-do-wells, homeless people and such, and they started it. The colonists started it. They threw snowballs and rocks at the British. There were only a couple British. The British only wounded one person, but here, if you look closely at this, it looks like the British are smiling to be shown shooting at the colonists. So this was the way the story went out using a hand-colored poster. Now, by the time of this lithograph, which is an Abraham Lincoln presidential campaign poster, this is a lithograph. Lithograph is made using, they used to use a piece of limestone that was flat, and they would draw on it in a crayon, a waxy crayon, and then they would wet the stone, and at that point, the water would reject acid that's poured on it, and then they would wash it down again, and then when they put it in the printing press, ink would only stick to the parts that had been hand-drawn. It was a very elaborate process, but it was a lot better process for making pictures. And so you get this one. And it's primarily black and white, although at the time, Currier and Ives printed in black and white, but then hand-colored. The next stage we get to is chromolithography, and that's what's going to be used during World War I. And this shows a contemporary artist at Tamarind, and what she's got, she has a block there, and usually now that's zinc, and she is hand-drawing on the plate, and then they will treat it, and they will be able to print off of it. On the right is how Paul Revere worked, using one of those sharp tools to cut into a metal plate. Well, when you get to lithography, you have a stone instead, and you shorten the process. And you can also use different stones to make different colors. So a chromolithograph can essentially have all the colors in it. Okay. So you get to have posters like this. This is from Strobridge Lithography, which was in Cincinnati and was one of the most famous of the printmakers in the 1900s. And this is the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a memorial print, but this is something you could buy and frame in your house. And these chromolithographs were extremely popular during that time period and were used for people's homes. They were much less expensive than an oil painting, but they were colorful and pretty. So posters get to be appraised. And so this is a hand-colored lithograph that was in a magazine. It's the centerfold. And it shows all these presidential candidates putting up their own posters. So that's how, one of the reasons they get really popular. And a poster like that could be made in multiple sheets until it gets billboard size. And so this one was billboard sized, and it advertised the musical play The Sidewalks of New York. And so this is 24 different sheets, all colored using multiple blocks. And so you get a huge, colorful print like this. Okay. Posters were also used for advertising. Now remember, we're way before television, we're before radio, we have newspapers around, but you don't have very many colored things. And so like a bookstore or a grocery store would have these poster-sized prints for Ivory Soap, or Harper's was a popular magazine, and the bookstore would have, each issue would have its own poster. So people were pretty much used to seeing those. Now this shows you Dayton, Ohio, about 1910. And you see the big billboards, many of which were colored at that point. See the streetcar and everything there. And the change that's happened that's important is not just the streetcar, and this one has carriages in it, but you begin to get automobiles. So when people are traveling a little faster, they don't respond to a small sign like this posted on the side of a board. They will react and see a large billboard like this. So that was a change, important change in American society. So then you also get to the movies. This is a movie theater in Lancaster, Ohio in 1913, and he has lots of movie posters out there. And by this time, by 1913, 3 million Americans went to the movies every day. It was a major and very inexpensive form of entertainment. And posters slide over into wartime because the movies slide over into wartime. So on the left you have Mary Pickford, very famous female star, and she starred in a 1917 movie called The Little American. And Mary is not very bright in this movie because she falls in love with both a German and a French officer. Not good at the same time. So she's in a very unhappy situation. And then you have Charlie Chaplin and his film Shoulder Arms. Shoulder Arms is a wonderful document of the war because when Chaplin comes in, he gets to be a soldier. He's absolutely horrible. He doesn't know how to do anything. His fellow soldiers in the trenches just ignore him. But then his mother sends him a block of Limburger cheese. And the Limburger cheese is so smelly that the other soldiers tell him to get out. So what he does instead is he throws the Limburger cheese towards the German lines. And the Germans faint, and he goes over and captures them. And then later on, he dresses up as a tree to go further into the German lines to capture the Kaiser. Well, it turns out all to be a dream, but it was a wonderful document, and Chaplin did a number of films that were great for World War I. So, all right, this is the Democratic Banner, is a newspaper in Mount Vernon, Ohio. This is June 28, 1914. And what happens here is an important royal pair. The Archduke Ferdinand and his wife are assassinated in Serbia. And in Europe at that time, there were all of these treaties and agreements between the different nations. So if one nation is attacked, and this counts as an attack, others will come to its aid. So very shortly after this, the war begins. And it includes all of Europe and begins to move into other places. But this is 1914. Another thing that grows at this time, another visual media, is editorial cartoons. They usually accompany the editorial in a newspaper, but it's very much like a poster in that there's not a lot of text. There's mostly just a scene which gives you an opinion. This is William Allen Rogers, who was from Springfield. That was a cartoonist for the New York Herald for 25 years. This is called strict neutrality. At this time, the United States was in neutral. It was not involved in the war. And most people did not want to be involved in the war. But the problem is, Uncle Sam is sitting here and there's bayonets all around him. So, dangers in all directions. Okay. Then the Lusitania. The Lusitania, when it set sails from New York on May 1st, 1915, is the largest passenger liner afloat. Titanic has already sunk by this time. So the Lusitania has about 2,000 passengers. It's under the British flag. It's a canard liner. And so it starts to cross the Atlantic. It gets within 11 miles of Ireland, and a German submarine sends in a torpedo and sinks it. Now, unlike the Titanic, which took more than 3 hours to sink, the Lusitania only took 8 minutes. So almost everyone on board, including 5 people from Cleveland, died. Now, the Germans thought they were doing the correct thing, but public feeling in America and Britain was very, very negative. Now, they were only 11 miles from the Irish coast. The captain of the liner had been warned that there were German ships around, but he assumed the biggest liner in the world would not be torpedoed. But the Germans had a different opinion. And they had printed a warning in 50 different newspapers around the country. This is the Germans. They said, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain, blah, 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 blah. And according to formal notice, the ships are liable to destruction in those waters, and travelers sailing on the war zone will be sunk. They're at their own risk. Of course, nobody paid any attention. And inside the ship, the Germans did have a good question, because the Lusitania had 173 tons of war munitions, 10.5 tons of rifle cartridges, 51 tons of shrapnel shells, lots of gun cotton, and 67 Canadian soldiers. But anyhow, that was pretty much ignored by the American public. They were really upset because the people were killed, the torpedo was sent with no warning. But at this time, although we're still, whoops, let me show you this first. This is another cartoon by William Allen Rogers. And what he's showing us is the U-boat, which comes from the German Untersee U-boat, is there. And he's taking a movie of a woman and child dying as the ship sinks. And so this was what was put out about this event. And the warning from the Germans is on the right there. Okay, so in a few days, this particular poster is the first major one of the war. It's published in June 1915, which is basically 2 years before the war starts. It's called Enlist. Big poster published by the Boston Committee of Public Safety. And posters, in order to be effective for people, need to have fairly few words and a picture that tells you a great deal. Now, the artist, Fred Spear, who did this, had read the newspaper reports from London, and he had read that in Ireland the bodies had come ashore and that there was a woman in a ball gown holding her baby that had come ashore. And she could not be separated from the baby, and so that's what he based the poster on, her sinking to the bottom. This is also the first American painting showing an underwater scene. But it very much seems to have Christian symbolism to it. It's very easy to read.
That's very effective.
Yeah, it is. It's very effective. Okay, then we have the first major example of sabotage in American history. Now, this is New York, and there are a lot of fire and explosions happening. There's an island called Black Tom Island that's in the harbor next to Manhattan. And on July 30th, 1916, this guy, who is a chief spy for the Germans, he calls himself the Dark Invader. He had set off pencil bombs. If you look up there, he had access to bombs that were the same size as a pencil, that were a timer with a little explosive in them. They could be set for up to 2 days in advance, and they had enough explosive in them that when they were placed on Black Tom Island, which is where the munitions to go to Europe were stored, an explosion occurred that shattered windows all over Manhattan, that killed people, that created great destruction. And so the American people were very upset about that too. Then we're back to election time, and Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election. And he's running on peace with honor, because we had not joined the war yet. He wanted to keep us out of war. On the upper left there is when he was campaigning in Columbus. This is the fall of 1950. And votes for Wilson, peace with honor, prosperity, preparedness, and he is re-elected. Then, the next thing that happens is something called the Zimmermann telegram, which you can see here. The German high command in Berlin sent a coded telegram that was supposed to go directly from Berlin to the capital of Mexico. And what it said was, if the president of Mexico would agree for Mexico to declare war on the United States, if the Germans won, they would get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which had been lost to Mexico in previous wars. So what happened to the telegram was that the British were very smart. There were 3 main cables for communication that went under the Atlantic. One of them went through London. The British cut the other 2. So all the communications from Europe went through the cable that went through London. They got the telegram, they decoded the telegram. And when they did that, they knew what the Germans were trying to do to engage another country in making war against us. Everyone was very upset. And you know, it was just another example of what could happen. But the British agents had gotten it first, which was great. Whoops. I want President Wilson first. So he's reelected. All these things have been happening. There's thought that there's more sabotage and things around the country, things are going to happen. So Wilson, on April 1st, 1917, does an address to Congress. On April 6th, Congress passes it. And what he says, the young men of America are going out to rescue civilization. They're going to fight for one definite thing, to save democracy from death. They are marching to give America's freedom to the oppressed multitudes of the earth. Now this is very different than the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That was a military attack by another country on us. Well, there had been sabotage, but this is a very idealistic idea. We wanted to save England and France that were democracies like we were. They were the source of ours. And so they have this kind of a reason for going to war. Now, one of Wilson's assistants is a man by the name of George Creel that helped him in his campaign in 1915. And Wilson, within 3 days of declaration of war, appoints George Creel to be the chairman of the Committee on Public Information. And this is the committee that's going to produce the posters. And what Creel wanted to do was to use emotion, to use expression in posters rather than using suppression, negative propaganda. Well, some of it's negative, but he wanted to do something different than we do today. And he appoints Charles Dana Gibson, who was the man who produced the Gibson Girl, to be the head of the committee. He gets a group of about 300 artists who become volunteers to create these posters. None of them are ever paid, and a lot of printing companies do the printing for free. Now, here is Gibson. Here's one of his famous posters. What it shows is a middle-aged lady with her son. She's taking her son and handing over to Uncle Sam. And the important words here are, she says, "Here he is, sir," and Uncle Sam says, "We need him and you too." So Uncle Sam is shaking hands with a woman as if she were an equal, and he's asking her for the support and work of women in the home front. So, very important poster, not a big one, but important. This shows you what Gibson was doing, the Gibson girl. I love this on the right. That's wallpaper available to bachelors in New York. Beautiful young ladies. Anyhow, so then one of the members of the committee that I've already mentioned is James Montgomery Flagg. This is him on the left. This is the poster that we opened up with. That was one of his first. Then, a lot of posters originated from magazine covers. And this one did too. So this is Leslie's magazine. This is the issue from July 4th, 1916. This is again before the war, but we have Uncle Sam. Well, it's not a totally original image. There's the poster on the left, but this is a British poster by Alfred Leet. And this shows Lord, just a minute, Lord, he was the head of the Boer War.
Carnarvon?
No, Kitchener had fought in the Boer War. Anyhow, the British started with that poster, which again was propaganda, because it started with a magazine. That's the image on the left. Here's a photograph of Lord Kitchener. And the photograph makes him look prettier than he was, but the poster will make him look even prettier because Lord Kitchener had a very bad squint in one eye. He had a terrible looking mustache, and he had a very weak chin. So what happened was, he gives him a nice strong chin in the poster, fixes up his mustache, and you can see his eyes are much more direct. So it's an improvement. Okay. The first real need in the beginning of the war is enlistment. And one of the ways that these posters encouraged enlistment was to create a two-sided situation. So it's an either or. So this is by Laura Bray, who was one of the first, and I think there are 4 women who do posters. And most of them, like this woman, we know almost nothing. But she shows a young man, obviously middle class, well-dressed, inside a window. And the soldiers are outside marching with a huge flag. So it's essentially saying, if you want to get out of the action, you better get out of the house and join the soldiers. It's intended to make them feel guilty if they don't. And a lot of posters also show the new technology. So, I think you've all seen the picture of the British Whippet tank that was in Navarre after the war. They sent a lot of them over. But we went into the war with horses. Matter of fact, Camp Sherman down in Chillicothe that was built for training had stable space for 20,000 horses, and all of those went to Europe. And so the war started using horses, but in a year and a half, they were using tanks. And they were advertising tanks on the poster. So we were all fighting then. And also, and tanks were produced by White Motor Company and another couple of companies in Ohio. And also bicycles. A sewing machine company in Dayton produced a war bicycle. And the bicycle was intended, when you don't have telephones and walkie-talkies and all of those ways of communicating between the generals and the trenches, you need a means of communication. And so the bicycle company in Dayton produced 20,000 bicycles, a great many of which went on the first ships to go to Europe, because a bicycle is quiet, it can go through narrow spaces, it can get behind the lines, so it was a great means of communication. And they built these war bicycles, which were very tough and such, and were used on the front. One of the things produced in Ohio. The new technology also included airplanes. Now, I may have mentioned this already, but the Wright brothers had only flown their first flight 8 years before the war. So, in 9 years, we have fighter planes, which is an amazing leap in technology, because not only can they fly, but they have a machine gun in front, which is timed to go between the rotation of the propellers. Now, this was not easy flying, and a lot of planes were created at Wright Field, which is near Dayton, in a factory there, and the first factory built in the United States for producing airplanes. And there were a lot of women who worked at that factory. And it's strange to me because what they did, they put the plane all together, they looked at it carefully, they tested it, then they put it in a crate. And they shipped the airplanes in crates over to France, where they were reassembled. They had to build a railroad from the port in France to where they put them together and the field. But you had both things, both the poster to get people to enlist to learn how to fly, and Ohio State was one of the main training centers for flying. And matter of fact, the new pilots smashed a few ceiling windows in the buildings at Ohio State because they were practicing dropping bombs, and they were just little bags of water, but they still, anyhow. And you also have the home production of new kinds of tires to be used on these planes, which they called battle planes or war planes. They didn't call them fighter planes. Okay. Posters were also to create fear on the home front. And so this is a poster by Joseph Pennell. The poster is there on the left-hand side. This is the original watercolor. Where is this scene? New York. Yes. So what it shows is New York Harbor burning with German planes and submarines and fire. And there were many people that were determined that the Germans would invade and they would have planes. There were lots of advertisements in the Cleveland and Columbus papers that showed airplanes coming in and bombing Ohio cities because they thought that we would not be able to prevent that. And they also wanted to create fear with images of the German soldiers. And they called them Huns, beat back the Huns. And the one on the left, or poster on the left, is by Harry Hops. The poster on the right is by Billy Ireland. Now, Billy Ireland was the chief cartoonist for the Columbus Dispatch for 40 years. And he created 3 posters. And this was typical. A lot of times, local artists would create a poster. And sometimes they were created by school groups that also made the posters. But you did not want this guy to be climbing in your window, especially if it's your daughter-in-law and the children and everything. So that was pretty scary. And they showed this one, Hun or Home. Now this reflected what was happening in Belgium, or had happened in Belgium by this time. The Germans had moved quickly to try and take Paris in only a few days. So they had to go through Belgium. And what they did is they slaughtered a lot of people, women and children. They took whole towns and shot them. Now, when I was in graduate school a long time ago, we were told that this was not true, that this didn't happen. And recent research in the last 5 years has proven that it did happen, that the horrible desecration and murdering in Belgium did actually occur. So, and the whole idea of using the words the Hun came from a speech that the Kaiser had given back during the Boxer Rebellion in China, when he asked his soldiers to act like the Huns that destroyed the Roman Empire. So that's how that term got to be used. And the German soldiers at the beginning of the war were equipped with this kind of a helmet, which you saw in the previous things. It's called a Pickelhaube. And it was absolutely, totally useless, although it looked great. It was just a very thin metal. It didn't keep out bullets. It hardly even kept out the rain. And Germans adapted to a more practical helmet. But this became the symbol of German soldiers as far as Americans were concerned. Now, this is another famous poster, and this one was produced in Cincinnati. Keep these off the USA. And so this is German jackboots with spurs, covered with blood. So the intention is for you to think, oh my God, here's an invading German soldier, his boots are already covered with blood. And this was created by Strobridge Printing in Cincinnati. The color in these posters is as dramatic now as it was when they were published because of the way they were printed as chromolithographs. So they really are amazing. And the whole idea was vivid images, plain speech, self-confidence, and energetic people, male and female. Okay, so one of the main symbols for America that is the leading actress in a lot of these posters is Columbia. Now we have the Columbia River and the Columbia University and such, but Columbia was the symbol of America from at least 1796 up until the late 1880s, and she was the virtue of America. She was liberty. She was all the good things about our country. She's dressed in red, white, and blue. The one on the left is a Courier and Ives that was printed at the time of the Civil War. And Civil War posters and magazines often showed Columbia. And here we have Columbia, and this is from a magazine, Frank Leslie's. And here it says, 1881, Columbia welcomes the victims of German persecution to the asylum of the oppressed, which is free immigration. Immigration open to everyone. And so Columbia at that point was welcoming immigrants to America.
Does Columbia kind of look like Wonder Woman, or is that just me?
No, I think Wonder Woman is a descendant. Okay, here you see her again, be patriotic. I like the one on the right. The Navy needs you. Don't read American history, make it, which is intended for young, idealistic young men to encourage them. Now, but another symbol becomes very important, and that's the Statue of Liberty. And this is a poster from 1917, enlist in the Navy for liberty's sake. And so the Statue of Liberty is taking over from Columbia. And this is the Statue of Liberty as it was installed in 1886. And the statue, the copper part of it, the outside, was designed by a sculptor by the name of Bartholdi, but the framework, the steel framework, was designed and made by Eiffel Tower, that guy. And so it was put together here and then mounted, but you can see the size of her face from that photograph. So she begins to appear on posters instead of Columbia. I like the one on the left from the Engineering News. Here she is. This is Liberty speaking. Give some money. And on the right, stand behind the boy in the trenches. We're going to talk about the bonds here in a second. But posters were printed in more than English. And there were a lot in Cleveland, for example, printed in Spanish or Hebrew or lots of other languages. Because one of the issues were, especially for posters, not that many people, not a very high percentage of the American public could read English. Many could speak it, but not all of them could read it. And so they put them in different languages. And this one is intended to encourage people to conserve food because they tried to send wheat flour and beef and those things directly onto Europe to the troops. And they did have refrigerated ships too. Another prominent symbol is Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam had been a symbol of America, a male symbol of America, since about 1804. He started to show up. And so this is a color advertisement for Magnolia ham, and this was printed in Cincinnati. On the right, he's shown trying to get these horrible people out of Washington. I think it's called Draining the Swamp. That's from 1876. I'd like to see that image come up again. And so, in addition to posters, you had streetcar display cards. So this shows Uncle Sam selling Liberty bonds to wealthy people. Oops, sorry. This one is an urban image, encourage immigrants to purchase bonds and war stamps. And so you see immigrants from different nations. You can tell from what they're wearing, what countries they're from, but they're buying more stamps too. And I like the little girl at the bottom here with the American flag. And Uncle Sam is shown in different ways. On magazines, that's Leslie's. Uncle Sam is hitting a baseball, which is actually the Kaiser's head. And often they had impersonators of Uncle Sam and Columbia at public events. They appeared all over the country. Okay, how were posters used? On the left, we have Louise Hall and Susan Fitzgerald, who were Ohio suffragists, posting some of the first World War I posters on the walls in Cincinnati. And on the right, Fatty Arbuckle, who was a movie star at that time, posting posters on Wall Street, I think. Okay, and you would find them in windows of businesses. This is Cincinnati in 1919. A cigar store, and this is an agricultural poster showing Columbia sowing seeds for gardens because food was very important. And at the time, they did seriously say, clean your plate. The children are starving in Europe because they were. And so it was important. But this is a cigar store somewhere in Ohio, but you see all of the posters that had taken over the main advertisements, and the cigars are only smaller than in the front. Sometimes they became billboard size. Sometimes they were hand painted. This one is a Navy lieutenant. He is hand painting this billboard in front of the Department of the Navy in Washington. That was done many times. This is Columbus, the State House, big billboard size campaign. This was a campaign in February of 1918. It lasted 4 months. They raised $3.3 million just in Columbus at that point. Some of them were encouraging enlistment, and here, James Montgomery Flagg is in front of the New York Public Library, and he's repainting the figure from this poster. This is called Tell That to the Marines. So this red-headed young man is taking off his coat because in front of him, the newspaper said, Huns kill women and children. So he's going to go enlist. But the artist was repainting duplicates of these in front of the public library. Often the posters tell the men on the home front, what should they do? How can they support the war effort? Well, one of the most important things was coal, because coal was used for heating, for producing electricity, for heating homes, really important. So some of the posters said, order your coal, dig more coal as much as you can, and puts the man, the miner, coal miner on the home front next to the soldier over in France. Then, the winters of 1917 and 1918 in Ohio were the worst in history. So we had a huge problem because coal was used for heating homes. Coal also ran the railroads that took the munitions and the soldiers to the East Coast to get on the ships. And so it was a real problem. So schools closed, libraries closed, lots of businesses closed because of the winter. And here's a cartoon from a Cleveland paper by Roy Grove. Please, dear Santa, bring us coal. So they're trying to stay warm at Christmas time. Okay, here's more for men. And these are created with a three-dimensional kind of image. You have a background in both of them, and then you have a man standing in a diagonal position, and your eyes will read a diagonal as action, as something happening. And so these work really well for that. They're very dynamic, and they're about 55 by 35 in size. This is the only major poster produced in America that shows an African-American man or woman. And this one was for the building of a new storage building for munitions in New York. But the artist who made it, Eric Beneker, included this man because many of his subjects in art were working men and women. He did this particular poster, Sure We'll Finish the Job, and this shows the artist working on that. He worked for a lot of companies, including companies in Ohio. And it was an effort to try and get management and workers closer together so that they would cooperate to get the maximum production for wartime. And so he's actually painting a working man who has little buttons on his chest for purchasing war stamps. We're going to get to that for a second, but there you can see them. And this was produced in the, the billboard size. But I want to show you this. Okay. The war was supported by donation, not by taxes. So if you went out and you bought Liberty bonds, you bought war savings stamps that started at 25 cents, or you bought your Liberty bonds, you would give the money to the government, they would pay you back with interest 5 years later. So instead of doing taxes, which you don't get back, this was giving money to the government knowing that you're going to get it back with interest. So that's how almost all of the cost of the war was paid. Where am I going here? Okay, yeah, the bonds were produced in denominations of $50,000 to $100,000. The bigger ones were produced by individuals, banks, and corporations. But in 1917 alone, U.S. citizens bought $18.7 billion worth of war savings bonds. And that would mean each person, each American, based on the population, raised $180 to give for Liberty bonds. So, you know, this was a definite commitment by the people, but they also knew they'd get the money back. So, I think that was a very significant thing. Also, the bonds and the savings stamps were the first form of saving, federally insured savings that many Americans had ever had. So this is the time that cash was used and sometimes checks. But this was a way that people learned how to save, how to buy savings bonds. You think about when I grew up, oftentimes a savings bond was a thing that you would give a grandchild or something. But that's how this all started, with those bonds. This is a bond, Liberty Bond tent in the public square in Cleveland. You can see how big they are. Oops, sorry. Okay, this is a food, don't waste it, because that was important in downtown Cleveland. Then in downtown Cleveland, they took a vacant lot and they built a replica of a French trench and a dugout so that you could go down and visit the trench. If you look at the arrow, there's a man standing there, so you can see the size of it. But this was an opportunity for people to kind of understand what this was like. And then they've got more posters up there as billboards. And when they did loan rallies for each of the Liberty loans, there were 5 of them, you got crowds like this. Sorry, I don't know why it's supposed to do that. But you have movie stars, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, selling the bonds, using the posters. Mary Pickford, on one weekend, sold $3 million worth of Liberty bonds in California. So, you know, the participation, and here you can see Charlie Chaplin on Douglas Fairbanks' shoulders, and this is New York City. Look at the people. This would not happen today. You don't even get that crowd for inauguration anymore. But they are all there to see the Hollywood stars. Well, I'm sorry. And then there were posters that were specifically directed at women.
You're trying to cause trouble, aren't you?
Well, anyhow, the one on the left, I really like this. Women help America's sons win the war. And it shows a woman looking at women, directed at other women. This is not a government bureaucrat encouraging people to give. This is a woman saying, we need to help sons, grandsons, husbands. And many of the early posters showed women in familiar roles. I mean, most women didn't dress like that even at that time, but showed them in familiar roles, like the Salvation Army, producing donuts that were cooked in helmets oftentimes for the soldiers. The trenches, they really were. The YMCA in particular was a small organization when it started out. This is a poster by Mason McMain, who was a famous woman artist. But the YMCA, during the war, produced, and it was small, mostly overseas. They had 26,000 paid staff. They performed 90% of all the welfare work with the soldiers in Europe. There was no government, federal troop, anyone to help the soldiers. The wards operated 26 rest and recuperation centers in France, 8,000 troop trains served by YMCA volunteers, 1,500 campaigns. They built 44 factories in Europe for the production of cookies and candy for the troops. 80,000 educational scholarships were given by the YMCA to war veterans, which is something that happens now from the federal government, but it was YMCA at that point. Red Cross is another organization that starts out very small, and this is one of the few posters that actually has a narrative in it, has a story. The young nurse on the right is asking her supervisor if she can take care of this young man, and that was actually produced by an artist in Duluth, Minnesota. But the volunteers for the Red Cross really were mobilized. This is Marietta, Ohio, and the Marietta chapter of the Red Cross Volunteers met on April 9th, 1917, so this is 3 days after war is declared, and they recruited in Marietta 2,604 volunteers. And what they did is they rolled bandages, because bandages didn't come in these convenient little plastic packages like they do now. They had to be hand cut and produced from muslin and things, and all members of the family would help with that. There was knitting, there was clothing that was made, there was pajama and coverings for the soldiers who were in the hospitals and things. And so you can see, Marietta was not that big a town at that point, as it is now. Okay, whoop. I don't know why it does that, it just wants to slip. Okay. Knitting was really important. And the American uniforms were not very warm. They were poor, they were made very quickly, and so women were encouraged to knit, and to knit all kinds of things. So you see these posters, our boys need socks, and in the trenches they did need clean socks. And you had, this is a piece of sheet music on the right, and Ohio produced incredible numbers of pieces of sheet music during the war. But this is, I wonder who's knitting for me. Mom, my girlfriend, and magazines like the Priscilla magazines published the specific directions for the garments that you should make. And so you could see that. And this was particularly necessary for the guys flying the planes. They were open cockpit, it was cold, they didn't have oxygen, they were up high, they had a balsa or rattan seat, and so they had to produce garments for them to wear when they were up there. And these are little children in a Cleveland classroom knitting. I don't know how many of these pieces actually went overseas, but it was a good way to involve children in the war. And I love this picture. These are Red Cross volunteers. They have the Cincinnati firemen, and they're teaching the firemen how to knit so that they can do something constructive in the firehouse between fires. That's a great picture. Activities like canning food were really important. And a disabled Belgian soldier who was in the United States for treatment did this one on the left, can the Kaiser, which I think is great. And this is the winner of a canning contest in Cincinnati during the war, and we know her name, Mrs. Frank Brown, but we don't know anything more about the contest. But food was really important. So you cut your sugar use, you remember that food is ammunition, you use food from corn, and so those were important and attractive. The other thing that was new in the United States was the Women's Land Army. So the British had had a Women's Land Army for a while, but in America, It didn't start until 1917, and 20,000 urban women, many among them were college kids, girls from Oberlin and from one of the Cleveland colleges volunteered. And because the guys who did the farm labor were gone, so women took over running the plows and picking the produce and everything. And this whole idea of a white woman going out and working on the farm was something that did not happen unless your dad owned the farm. So it was unwomanly. So this was introducing another new idea into the mix. Also, the one on the left by Adolf Treeler shows a woman with the V for victory, and she's wearing Liberty overalls, not a skirt, and she has an airplane in one hand and a bomb in the other, which represents the munitions that were created with women's help during the war. On the other side, same slogan, for every fighter, a woman worker, showing women who are going to be working on munitions and other factory work. On the left there, you have women working at the Dayton Wright airplane factory, stretching silk to go over the wings, and on the right, stenographers. Communications was just booming in technology during the war, and so women moved more and more into office work. These are at Cleveland Hardware Company in 1917. These are Slovenian, Croatian, and German women working drill presses. Now these women did not know English, but they could contribute because when they were shown their task, they would go ahead and do it. And it was their introduction for many of them into learning English and producing money that could be used to help their families. Children were enlisted in the war effort also, and this is just a photograph I got on eBay from Central Ohio from 1918. The teacher is dressed up in a Liberty kind of dress. They have the flag in the back, and this is the time that singing national anthems and all kinds of things like that began to be included in school. And you had posters directed at kids, or at least directed at their parents. Little Americans, do your bit. Eat oatmeal, corn, mush, hominy for breakfast. Other corn cereals. This one, boys and girls help Uncle Sam win the war. And the little girl there we know is from Cleveland. We don't know how she was involved, but I do have a photograph showing her modeling for that poster. Gardens, war gardens, were very important in schools as well as for adults. And the production of fresh vegetables in the United States, the first year of the war, tripled because of home gardens. People producing food. Many industries tore up all their lawn spaces and gave their employees plots for gardening. General Electric in Cleveland it wasn't called General Electric, but it was called the company or the plant, did like 12 or 14 acres, so they were all created for the employees to use. And the employees saved most of the produce themselves because most of them lived in apartments and they didn't have any other opportunity to raise food for their families. Oh, the poster on the right is by a woman by the name of Maggie Nell Wright. That's Frank Lloyd Wright's sister. She was an important writer and illustrator of children's books at the time. Whoop. I don't know why it's a bouncing like that. Okay. This is a boys' garden in Dayton in 1918. Here are boys holding posters, going around and trying to get contributions for war stamps and bonds, and there were lots of contests for kids that were put out by big industries with wonderful prizes in them for raising money for the war. An Ohio artist, Howard Chandler Christie, who was from the Zanesville area, did a lot of posters for the war. The one on the right, The Spirit of America, and he was a self-taught artist who started drawing when he was age 4, and he went with what was then Colonel Teddy Roosevelt to Cuba to ride with the Rough Riders and produce these illustrations of the war in Cuba. And he got to know Teddy and rose in fame, and he produced what was called the Christie Girl, which was kind of like the Gibson Girl, very romantic female. But then he did posters like this. They're among the most famous. If you want to fight, join the Marines, in which he dressed lovely young ladies up and drew the attention of young men to help promote enlistment. There were a lot of posters, not very pretty ones, warning about Germans. If you were of German heritage, if you were of a religion that used German in the service, if you went to a German school, and there were many of these in Ohio, many of them did not exist. The Boy Scouts in Cleveland burned every book in German language that they could find. This happened in Columbus and Cincinnati. The German schools were closed, and smaller groups of people, like Amish and such, who did their church services in German, were forbidden. And even the president said, if you had a name that sounded German, if you introduced yourself as German American, you were certainly a spy. So there were a great many nasty things that happened to people of German descent. Well, all right, you're going to go ahead. Being in a library, I thought I would include this. The American Library Association, I'm skipping a lot of text here. The American Library Association in 1917 established a committee on mobilization, which was invited to provide library services to U.S. soldiers and sailors in the United States and overseas. It's called the Library War Service. Between 1917 and 1920, they mounted 2 financial campaigns and raised $5 million to erect 36 camp libraries, so those training camps, and another 400 locations, military hospitals and libraries overseas in France and such, because the soldiers spent a lot of time waiting, even in the trenches, or they were in the hospital. They needed something, and so you could buy a magazine at the corner store. You could say on the upper right-hand corner, when you're done with this magazine, give it to your local library, it will be shipped to France. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books were shipped overseas. The library at Camp Sherman in Chillicothe had 40,000 volumes. And so libraries were really, really important. And were sent overseas. In Ohio alone, there were 250,000 books donated to that campaign. So, all right. This is another one of the libraries, the camp library, like that. Okay, we're at the end of the war now. So, Hennigan and Company in Cincinnati printed this poster. It's an Ohio-based poster. It's the only one I've found nationally that celebrates the end of the war and welcoming home the troops. So it's a nice one. It's got Columbia back in it, but the other one I really like, and they thought we couldn't fight. So this shows the soldier having gone through the battle, victorious, carrying German Pickelhaube helmets, and wounded and such, but it became victory. And so, this is the Peace Day celebration in Cleveland, January 27th, 1919. And I love this with the women with the Liberty hats on top, riding in a car. This is another one of the Peace Day. How is it doing that? Okay, another one of the Peace Day ceremonies. This is the employees of a cloak factory of women who came out to watch the parade. Another one showing the Kaiser as the devil standing on his coffin. So there was a little bit of humor in there too. And then this one, which is a photograph I bought off of eBay, Cleveland women dancing around a returning soldier and a sailor. So in many ways, the posters colored the war, but they drew the American people at home closer to what was happening overseas and tried to ensure the commitment of people, whether they be child, woman, man, whatever, to the war effort. And obviously they worked. because every museum I've ever worked at, which is now 15 maybe, collected World War I posters. Many did not collect World War II posters. By World War II, you had a lot more magazines, you had a lot of radio, a lot of other means of communication, and the posters were not as effective. But I think also the artists were not as dedicated, and the illustrators of the early 1900s were often some of America's greatest artists. Christie, who was from Ohio, painted presidents and popes and royalty in England, as well as doing posters and things. A lot of them did. So these were American great artists who were involved in this. So they became memorable, and they usually communicate very well to people, which encouraged people to save them. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
That time frame of this was about the golden age of postcards too, from like 1898 to the First World War.
Yes.
And a lot of the illustrators that you're mentioning also did postcards.
Yes.
of the days.
Yes, they did. Postcards were extremely popular, both real photo postcards and the more illustrated ones. And I know I've collected some of those from time to time. They were wonderful methods of communication. And it was easy to get your family picture put on a postcard to send to Aunt Mabel in, I don't know, New York.
I got her picture too.
I bet.
And North Canton was changed from New Berlin.
Yes.
North Canton for the same time frame for the German influence.
Right, that's in my home front lecture about they changed the name. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How did Uncle Sam come about? Do you know?
Uncle Sam came about in about 1804. There was a symbol of Great Britain by the name of John Bull, who was often shown as a personification of England, and somehow Uncle Sam started to appear. We know that there was a guy with the initials of US who provided barrels of food to the troops during the Civil War, but the images of Uncle Sam start in 1804.
They look very similar. I've
Yeah.
seen the pictures of John Bull. They look very similar.
It's just like Columbia looks very much like the British Britannia.
Was Nast then the one that made him more popular, Thomas Nast?
He did, but it was a lot of it was before his time, but he used it. He was shown in a lot of the cartoons. And you know, you need a form of written shorthand. And showing Uncle Sam, you know, you're essentially putting America in a small package to fit in your picture. And he also was a man of judgment. He was older. He looked intelligent. You know, he was sort of like you want to be pictured.
Do you have any Maslin or Stark County stories to share with us?
Most of my lectures I've been able to find, but I have not found much from locally here, which is partly due to the fact that my husband now has a very bad illness, and I haven't been traveling much in the past 3 weeks or a month. I'm sure that there are.
You can talk to Andy Altonstall at the museum. I do know that they have a few posters in their collection.
You mentioned the Victory Gardens. In Maslin, some of the Victory Gardens were on 9th Street Southwest.
Were they?
Yeah, there's an Eaton plant was there. And then just on the west side, the Eaton plant was all open. Those were Victory Gardens during the Second World War.
Yeah.
A lot of the local businesses were converted to making munitions and things for the war effort too.
Yes. Platt Iron Works in Dayton created $5 million worth of artillery shells for Russia 2 years before we declared war. And also, the Secretary of War during Wilson's administration was a former mayor of Cleveland. And so he had many connections to industry in Ohio, which is maybe why a lot of these contracts were signed up with Ohio companies.
We can take one more question for the library says to take us out.
Yeah.
I just have one comment.
Sure.
I was recently in Alaska and I saw a display there, and it was talking about how important Alaska was to the different war efforts.
Mhm.
And they said that from this area of the country, there was a lot of airplanes made.
Yes.
And they were sent to Alaska, and in Alaska, they were transferred over to Russian pilots, and the Russians then were trained on the planes, and then they sent those to the front to fight the Germans on the east front, which took pressure off the western front in Europe.
That's cool, and I noticed that they have recently found some American ships that were sunk during when the Japanese fought their battle off the coast of Alaska, which was the closest battle to the United States. There were a number of ships sunk, and they've recently found a few of those.
Well, the Japanese had plans to invade the U.S. through Alaska and coming down.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming on such an asking
Thank you,
night.
that was outstanding.
I do just have a few real quick reminders. So our World War I exhibit, the home front in the Great War Spring Hill in World War I opens Sunday, September 9th. We'll be open for tours Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays from 1 to 4 p.m. We do have a brand new audio tour that's all about World War I, so you can check that out. And we have also included some information on the 322nd, the subject of our next lecture, which is Tuesday, September 25th, here at 6:30. Cyrus Moore, who's one of our AmeriCorps volunteers, he's a World War I reenactor, will be coming and speaking specifically on Horatio Wales' regiment. And it's actually, Susan, you made a nice little segue for me on that, because he was drafted or asked to join that because he was a horseman. So they were using horses still in the field artillery.
Absolutely.
So fun
Who's
fact.
Cyrus? Who's?
Cyrus Moore, he is an AmeriCorps volunteer from Athens, Ohio. He is also a World War I volunteer or reenactor, and whenever I have questions, I ask him.
And also, mention of horses, also, this was the first time the dogs were used in warfare. A lot of dogs were used in warfare. And some American dogs, one of them won the Croix de Guerre of France. But this is the time that they trained the dogs to go out and find the wounded and to bring the supplies and to bring messages back and forth.
A lot of horses in World War.
A lot of horses, but the dogs really ended up being very successful, saved a lot of lives. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. No, very true. The Dennis and Depot's little mascot thing is from World War I, and it's one of the dogs from that era. Our other two talks, the one for October 23rd, is on the Spanish flu. That will be by Amanda Sedlak-Hefner. She is our intern and has put the entire exhibit together, and she will also be trying to focus a little bit on the Spanish flu's impact on Stark County. We have been told that they canceled the McKinley game because of the Spanish flu, and that's a big deal.
1918?
1918, yeah.
Yeah, 1918.
Yeah, it was a big deal. And then our very last one on November 27th is our on Red Cross nurses. The photo that you saw of the Red Cross nurses from Marietta is one I know is in that presentation. Jane Young will be giving that, and she is a reenactor who talks specifically about Ohio Red Cross nurses. Other than that, if you guys are interested, we do have information on the exhibit in the back, including all of the dates, if you'd like to grab one, or any other upcoming events. Next Thursday will be our monthly Trivia Thursday down at Jen's Place, 6:30 to 8:30. It's a lot of fun. You'll be stuck with me again for 2 hours.
Where is that?
Jen's Place, right downtown. You know where Smiley's is?
Oh, yeah.
3 storefronts down from Smiley's. And there's one other thing. Also, the Spring Hill is a privately funded nonprofit, so I do have a donation canister in the back if you would like to help make a donation to the house. That means that we get to keep doing these lectures and programs like this for free for our public. If you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, but the library does kick us out at 8 o'clock, so can't be too long. Thank you so much for coming.
That was phenomenal.
Oh, I'm glad. Put this down.